Good morning, everyone. My name is Laura Brown. I'm the Energy Research Programme Manager at Newcastle University. Thank you for joining us today for the Centre for Energy webinar on getting from here to there, transition to net zero. We've got a distinguished panel of contributors today, and I'd like to thank them for joining us. I'd also like to thank my colleague, Kate Kelly, for organising the workshop today. And I'd like to thank you all for joining us again. I'm going to start by introducing the three speakers that we have. Sarah Walker is the Reader in Energy at Newcastle University. She's spent 8 years at De Montfort University, where she did her PhD in the impact of electricity sector deregulation and renewable energy market share. She then moved out from academia into industry and worked for 5 years in consultancies, energy consultancy. She has moved back into academia for her sins and has worked in a variety of senior academic roles at Northumbria and now Newcastle University. And in 2019, she became the director of the Newcastle University Centre of Research Excellence for Energy. And we know that is a Centre of Energy and who's hosting us today. And Sarah's also became the director for the National Centre for Energy Systems Integration. We then have Dr. James Fleming, who's Head of Energy Theme at EPSRC. He has a degree and a PhD in chemistry from the University of Bristol, and after a few years of postdoctoral work, he joined EPSRC at the end of the last millennium. He has worked in a variety of roles across EPSRC before becoming Head of the Energy Theme in 2017. And we also have Professor Audley Janus joining us from Kingston University, who's a Professor of Innovation there. He won a joint studentship from the ESRC, EPSRC, which allowed him to undertake a successful PhD at Aston University. And his research topic was in energy technology policy and innovation related to North Sea oil. Audley has pursued a research on innovation and institutional change in the renewable energy sector and sustainable production and consumption. And he left Aston in 1993 to take up a lectureship at Brunel University and later worked at Royal Holloway, University of London. And he spent most of the 2000s so far at Newcastle University, where he was subject group lead for innovation. Audley joined Kingston University since 2012 and was appointed director of the Small Business Research Centre in January 2020. So thank you very much for joining us. And if we can start with Sarah, please.
Great, could I have the first slide, please? So thank you, Laura, for the kind introduction. As she said, I'm the director of the Centre for Energy, and I'm kicking off today to say a little bit about our target in the UK of net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And I'm going to say a little bit about the nature of that challenge, because I think it requires some quite radical change and some quite rapid change. But I think that we shouldn't be afraid of that challenge, and we should believe in ourselves in order to address it, which is why I've put this quote in here. Next slide, please. So the scale of the challenge then, when we look at our greenhouse gas emissions in the UK, then over time since 1990, which is the baseline that historically we compare against, our most recent data for 2019 shows that we've had a 45% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions since 1990. And in fact, over the last year, we've had just over 3.5% decrease in total greenhouse gas emissions between 2018 and 2019. So those lines on the graph on the left-hand side show a consistent downward trend. It's relatively linear and relatively shallow in terms of the rate of change, but we're certainly going in the right direction. So there's a positive to start the day with. Next slide, please. So when we look at where those emissions are coming from, then we can break it down by sector. Most of what I do is I'm interested in the residential sector, which is the yellow bit of this pie chart. But actually transport is quite a significant emitter of greenhouse gas emissions. That's the orange bit at the bottom, showing 27%, and then business 15%. Energy supply is primarily the way in which we generate our electricity at 21%. And then other was a range of different activities such as agriculture, public sector, third sector emissions. So what's important to note in terms of where our emissions come from is that in some areas we have got quite a clear idea of how to reduce emissions in these sectors, but for other sectors it's quite difficult for us to understand how we might achieve net zero. Next slide, please. So this is the scary slide, unfortunately. On the left-hand side, the very first bit of the graph is our actual change in emissions that I've labelled there. And then the way that the UK government has determined how it plans to reduce greenhouse gas emissions is based on budgets that are produced by the Committee on Climate Change and then are approved by government. So the next solid line labelled there is the approved budgets from the Committee on Climate Change that also show how we're going to be reducing our greenhouse gas emissions out to 2032. And then on the far right-hand side of the graph are two lines. One was the original 80% by 2050, and then I've labelled a dashed line, which is the 2050 net zero plan now. So that's an estimate based on government guidelines of how we're going to achieve net zero. And that's primarily based on the Committee on Climate Change's report on 2050 and how we could reduce emissions from different sectors. And then the final curved line, which has got a red arrow to it, is some work done by a colleague at Manchester called Kevin Anderson. And he estimated our greenhouse gas emissions reduction that were necessary to meet the Paris Agreement. So there are various different agreements in place. The Paris Agreement is by the Conference of the Parties that was held in Paris. And the Paris Agreement signed up to by most countries stated that we were aiming for a target emissions reduction in order to maintain the global average temperature at no more than 1.5 to 2 degrees increase compared to baseline. So this still is a degree of warming under the Paris Agreement, and the Paris Agreement requires us to rapidly decrease our greenhouse gas emissions. So it's quite a different trajectory compared to the current government's 2050 net zero plan. On the right-hand side, I've just showed some relative changes to some of the different sectors, so you can see which sectors are making more progress than others. We're doing really well in the power sector to reduce greenhouse gas emissions as we increase the amount of renewables that we're seeing on the system, and we're reducing the amount of coal that's being used for generating electricity. Business and transport saw a reduction in the last year, so did residential. Public was one of the sectors that increased last year. Next slide, please. So if we're going to make some significant changes and do that in a way that meets the Paris Agreement, we need to think about a radical transformation, and we need to think about how we're going to get there. In order to think about how we're going to get there, it's worth recognizing where we currently are. We're currently in a system which is fragmented. Our policy is fragmented across different government departments. Our industry is fragmented across different activities that the sectors do. It's not very coordinated. Our greenhouse gas emissions, and particularly our carbon, is still too high, although, as I said before, we're making some progress. But there's lots to do. Transport is still our biggest sector, and heating for homes and businesses is something that we haven't got a firm solution on for decarbonisation. Our energy costs are still relatively high, and we need to be realistic about how a transformation of our energy use is going to hit individual vulnerable customers, and we need to think about how to make that affordable. And in terms of security of supply, our security of supply in the UK is pretty good. Some customers in very remote areas will see a poorer quality of service, but the vast majority of the UK is getting very good service. As we see more ICT, so information and communication technologies, we could expect to see more cyber security vulnerabilities. And as we move towards more significant climate change in the UK, then our current level of security, which is called N-1, which means that of all the numbers of units in the system, we should be able to cope with the loss of one, and the system should still work perfectly okay. That might no longer be adequate in a significant climate change scenario. And we still have concerns about geopolitical events, so things like the OPEC countries that control oil prices, our supply of gas from vulnerable areas of Russia, and so on. Next slide, please. So one way to address these issues and to come up with a radical transformation is to do it through a whole energy systems approach. And that's something that we're looking at the National Centre for Energy Systems Integration. So we're thinking about energy demand, we're thinking about energy supply as well, and all different types of energy supply, as well as all different types of energy demand. And we're thinking about how supply gets to the point of demand through the necessary infrastructure, including storage as part of that, and the enabling role that data analytics, big data, and computing takes. So that's one of the projects going on at Newcastle University that's trying to address this rapid transformation. Next slide, please. So if we're going to achieve this lovely utopia of net zero greenhouse gas emissions, then the Committee on Climate Change has stated that it believes that we have all the known technologies that we need. And it's simply applying those technologies that will get us to net zero. I disagree with this point of view, but I want to tell you a little bit about some research that we're doing and how we're trying to better understand some of the technologies and some of the society changes that might be needed. Next slide, please. So in relation to transport, one of the projects at Newcastle University is called Decarbonate. It's working with the Northern 8 universities to look at how we can decarbonise transport. And this is their pathway at the moment that they're talking about. The first one is to maintain what transport infrastructure we have. This is not new infrastructure, this is maintaining existing infrastructure. Item 2 is to be net zero emissions ready. And by that, we mean let's think about and ensure we're ready for alternative fuels. And that's the purple arrow that I've put there. This is the area that Newcastle in particular are working on. So we're looking at electric vehicles, which is EVs. We're looking at hydrogen and ammonia that are fuels that can be used with fuel cells. Fuel cells turn those fuels into heat and electricity, and the byproduct is water. Another alternative fuel for transport is biomass, and of course a zero emissions form of transport is also walking and cycling. So it's not just transitioning to different fuels, it's transitioning to different modes of transport that are also low emission. And then item 3 is investing to travel less. Item 4 is re-engineering our cities for people. So this is some of the stuff that we've seen during COVID around making pavements wider, having protected cycleways to enable people to walk and cycle. Hoping that some of those changes stay in place. And 5 is to fund better housing development, with the idea being that if housing development is close to the other societal needs like being near to schools, being near to doctors, then potentially you can use walking and cycling and public transport to get to those other items through better housing design. Next slide, please. So in terms of the next category, which is really around residential energy use, then if we're looking at energy use in buildings, then a project that Newcastle are involved in is called the Active Building Centre. So a lot of the energy use in buildings is for heating and hot water. Kate, can you click the slide, please? And so one thing that we can look at is ways in which we can reduce the need for energy in buildings. So some of that is the energy use during construction and the embodied energy in the materials that we're using and embodied carbon. The second is to design our buildings to use as little energy as possible. The third is to then look at renewables. Can you click again, please, Kate? And so if we were to, and again, if we were to prioritize the way that we design and alter our buildings, it should be about using less, it should be using efficiently, it should be decarbonisation of heat, and technologies for decarbonisation of heat include heat pumps, heat networks, biomass, and solar thermal. Click again, please. And so in Active Building Centre, what we're looking at is all the different components of the building, how they might be coordinated in order for the building to offer support to local networks in a way that enables the network to cope if we move to more electrified heating. Next slide, please. So if we were to look also at the power sector and how we can decarbonise that, then there's a few studies presented here. This is a review of different scenarios done across Europe by different projects. And in terms of renewables, they're represented quite significantly. So wind and solar are the two blue colours, and most scenarios have quite significant contribution from those. There's very little contribution in these future scenarios from traditional fossil fuels. Next slide, please. And so in the electricity sector and our gas sector, one thing that we've seen very recently is pressures on the electricity sector during COVID because demand has dropped through the floor. And we've had days that have been particularly windy and sunny. One way that we could cope with that is if the network, the electricity network, was able to make use of any excess electricity through electrolyzers to produce hydrogen. Hydrogen is a kind of gas. We could put that into our gas network as a way of storing it, ready to use later in combined heat and power units, that's the CHP, and maybe in vehicles that run off hydrogen. Next slide, please. So it is my belief that where we are and where we need to get to involves a whole energy systems approach. Click again, please. And so in terms of that whole systems approach, it really is every component of our energy systems. And I say energy systems, not electricity systems, because it's all energy systems that we need to think about. And we need to make a start. We need to recognize that this is a challenge, but we need to have faith in ourselves. Click again. And again. Great, thanks. And so we just need to get on with it and to make a start and to try and move towards that more rapid decarbonisation rather than the more linear one, because without a rapid decarbonisation, we're going to overshoot our Paris Agreement, overshoot our 2-degree target, and potentially have quite significant climate change impacts to live with. Next slide. So if you want to get involved and find out more, our contact details for the Centre for Energy are just there. Thank you very much. You're muted, Laura.
You're still muted, Laura.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Sarah. Just a quick note, I forgot to say at the beginning, we're we welcome participation from the audience, and we're going to have questions at the end of the session. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat window. If anyone hasn't used Zoom before, move your mouse around. On my screen, it's the chat button at the bottom, and you should be able to see a little, and just put your question in there, and we'll compile those sessions at the end, and ask the questions of the panel. Are you ready to go, Kate? And we'll start with Jim's presentation. Just need to be in slideshow mode. Thank you. Thanks, Jim.
Okay, so yeah, thanks, Laura. And what I'm going to say is going to follow on and agree and echo with what Sarah said very, very closely. So I probably have too many slides, so this gives me the opportunity to go perhaps slightly faster, because you've already heard quite a lot of what I'm going to say, or at least the ideas behind it. So just to introduce who EPSRC is for anyone who doesn't know. So we are part of UKRI, UK Research and Innovation. That's all the research councils, Innovate UK and Research England. We in turn get our funding from BEIS, and obviously BEIS in turn, so we get their funding from Treasury. Roughly the same time UKRI was formed. So EPSRC has been around for a long time now, but UKRI was formed sort of little over a year and a bit ago. The government sort of moved to protect the amount of funding that we put into research and development from a relatively low amount compared with our OECD colleagues. So we are, for example, in that graph you can see there, we are currently were the purple line, and the target is to move us up to the green line, which is a fairly significant increase as a percentage of our GDP. Normally at this point I point out that GDP can go down as well as up, but I probably don't need to point that out just at the moment. So who EPSRC is? So we are the largest of the research councils. So overall we have a pretty big budget, about 4.6 billion spent at any one time. That influences a great deal of the economic activity of the UK. And also we see a lot of collaboration, a lot of multidisciplinarity, and a lot of leverage on the funding that we put out. So this is our strategic delivery plan. All the research councils have to put out a delivery plan. And this is sort of in the process of being updated. But I think one of the points that I would get across is sort of everything that we do in energy and decarbonisation very much sort of fits under sort of one of our main priorities, which is sort of making a resilient nation. EPSRC funds all the engineering and physical sciences research areas you might expect, many of which sort of feed into energy, which is down there on the bottom right. So obviously is the most important of all of those particular topics. So traditionally we've been very much driven sort of since, I think it's about 2004, by the energy trilemma. How do we reduce emissions, enhance security supply, and reduce costs? A lot of things actually Sarah was talking about. But as she pointed out, sort of Net Zero report came out just a little over a year ago and has completely changed the landscape, in that this is now actually sort of in UK law that we will try to meet net zero on all greenhouse emissions by 2050. And this is, I think it's another point I'd sort of add to sort of the various graphs that Sarah had, is this is a significant difference. Going from a 20% of greenhouse emissions to zero is a real step change. I think the other thing we could also point out is this is taken directly from the CCC report, that this sort of a lot of these areas fit very nicely into sort of the how the energy theme has supported things, but it also goes beyond this into net zero into sectors that we wouldn't normally deal with and have to look at decarbonising as well, such as land use, agriculture, aviation, and some of the other ones that perhaps some of our sister research councils do tend to look at, but perhaps not in this way of focusing on decarbonisation. So I think there's sort of an opportunity, and certainly my my colleague Sam Richards, who works closely with me as head of decarbonisation, is particularly looking into those, how engineering and physical sciences can contribute to meeting those goals. So this is a variation of the data that Sarah put up. This is just, I think, CO2. It's not all greenhouse gas emissions that she put up. But I think sort of, I personally find it quite useful because it shows another version of how difficult meeting net zero will be. Particularly sort of, as she stated, transport is the single biggest emitter of not only greenhouse gas, but CO2 in particular. But also the fact that it hasn't really changed since 1990. So most of the reductions that we've seen have been in power, which is the red line, and also in industry, which is the brown line. I think power is a success story. Industry, that potentially hides sort of a lot of stuff there. One way we have decarbonised industry is by not doing it and getting other people to do it for us, which is not necessarily a sustainable strategy going forward. I think the other point that Sarah brought out was heat. So you can see sort of the proxy for heat is the blue wavy line that you can see in front of you here. And this is data that Grant Wilson from Birmingham produces updates on a regular basis. But I think it also gets across quite how difficult decarbonising heat is going to be. So obviously we are fully aware of sort of the interseasonal nature of our requirements for heat. But I think also what this graph shows is quite how big the difference between summer and winter is, how different extreme weather events can be. You can see the beast from the east sort of points out by the purple arrow there, quite how much larger that is. You then sort of see the differences even within a single winter by the different sort of how the different demands go up and down. And actually sort of, you can't see it here, but certainly sort of work that people in Newcastle and elsewhere have done is also within a day showing how those demands change. And I think sort of is worth reflecting on that because it just shows how difficult it will be to take from where we have been traditionally to where we need to go into decarbonising heat. So this is another of the sort of happier stories. So the UK emissions have fallen sort of significantly since 1990, exactly as Sarah's already told you, which has not necessarily been the case for our G7 partners. I think also the point it's worth stressing is that this is not necessarily at the expense of economic growth. Our economic growth pretty much matches the rest of the G7, but our success in decarbonisation is considerably better with the proviso around industry I already mentioned. So if you want to know what the energy programme has been doing, this is actually quite a nice summary of it, which is available on the EPSC website. It says it was written by me. It's not entirely true, but ignoring that, it's actually quite a nice summary of all the work that, that the energy programme has done over a number of years. So how are we structured? Most things within EPSC will look at a number of research areas. So you'll see sort of under renewables, solar, bioenergy, and offshore renewables. But I think we increasingly are trying to stress the outcomes. Why are we funding those research areas, and sort of looking at sort of how does it contribute to the decarbonisation agenda? How does it decarbonise the electricity or gas grids? How does it decarbonise industry, heat, or transport? And this is not something that we've done in response to the Committee for Climate Change. This is quite an old slide. This is something that we implemented at least a couple of years ago. So I think most people saw the way that we had to change sort of quite some time, but that's not to underestimate sort of the impact that the Committee for Climate Change report has made. So who are the people who do all the work? So obviously as myself, but then there's my colleague Sam Richards, who's head of decarbonisation, and he's on one of the ISCF teams. And there's the rest of the team. You may be interested in who are the people to contact for your particular areas. I think the other thing I would stress is to meet these gains, it's energy is particularly a multidisciplinary activity. So we got some sort of visualizations of just to show what that means in practice. So this is the maths program. The different colored dots are people working in different research areas. And you'll see pretty much, as you might expect, that there's relatively little interaction between different networks within those research areas. If you go to what the engineering program funds, then again, you'll actually see a significant change with engineering being a much more collaborative endeavor. But then the programs, so the energy program funds show a significantly increased degree of interconnectivity and multidisciplinarity. And hopefully those visualizations show that. To take that a little bit further, this is deliberately a very old slide, Research Council's energy program. Obviously, we're not RCUK anymore. So, but I deliberately put it forward because this is how the Research Councils, working with Innovate and sort of also with government colleagues, have been working for a significant period of time. Very much working sort of trying to work together to meet these aims. And sort of obviously this diagram puts UKC at the middle of everything, but for the research council, so we are sort of 78% of all the funding that goes out on energy. Just to give a few examples of how we do work together. Sort of, for example, UKIRC has been funded, the UK Energy Research Centre has been funded by across councils for a considerable period of time. We've worked together, say, for example, with NERC on offshore renewables, with NERC on CCUS, CDTs, the only co-funding across councils in the last EPSRC CDT activity was, okay, Laura, thanks, was from NERC in the energy space, and so on. And those are the contacts for the people in the other research councils. So our current priorities, traditionally we've been focused on the energy dilemma. Everything is very much about net zero now. Our number one priority is the systems approach, exactly as Sarah already mentioned. I think the other thing that we'll particularly stress is reducing energy demand and consumption, which perhaps is not something you see quite so much in the CCC report and government policy. And I think also one of the things we'll see particularly going forward is how do we accelerate the deployment of technologies. Like Sarah, I don't believe that all the technology that we ever need and all the research we'll ever need is already done. And I think actually to get that last 20% will be particularly challenging, and we'll need some really deep and effective research, but we need to look at how we can get that deployed rather quicker than happens traditionally or has happened to date. Just to stress some of the things that we've been doing recently, but I'm running out of time, so I'll just leave that slide there, and obviously I think more than happy to share the slides afterwards and you can look at them then. Also to flag, as part of the ICF, industrial decarbonisation activity, we have Mercedes Marotta-Vela at Heriot-Watt is leading the research wing of that particular activity. We have a number of forthcoming calls, so all the ones sort of underlined are already live. And then one thing that we're working on is something around grid scale into seasonal storage. Just to stress, one of the big opportunities coming forward is COP26, which now is happening November 2021, but still in Glasgow. And to get ourselves ready for that, we've at the moment there'll be a number of activities across government, particularly sort of within UKRI. And one thing that we've launched with ESRC is some COP26 fellowships to help support activity and engagement as part of that particular process. And that activity is now live on the website. And just to say, if there's any sort of investigators there, extensions to closing dates to all calls for proposals to allow people, because we're working in a rather different environment than we used to. No cost extensions are not a problem as a result of any sort of impact of COVID activities. We've already across UK announced sort of cost extensions for PhD students, certainly for in their final years. There will be more announcements coming out sort of over the coming weeks. So if people are interested, that is the link to follow to get the latest information. So I've got questions, but I believe we're waiting for questions for, at the end after Audley's talk. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks very much, Jim. Indeed, we will have opportunity for questions after Professor Junius's talk. And therefore hand over to Audley. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Laura. I hope you can all hear me and see the first slide there. I'm the director of the Small Business Research Centre at Kingston University in London. I'm also a former employee of Newcastle University. I was there for about 8 years until 2010 as part of the business school, but also I had a role within the Swan Energy Institute in relation to business and public engagement. I'll be touching on some of those issues as I go through the presentation, because just picking up on what Sarah was saying in particular, this is quite a time. It's a time for concerted action by all in relation to achieving the targets that we want to achieve in relation to net zero. And I want to say something which is somewhat provocative, but maybe not too surprising, bearing in mind what we've just been hearing over the last 45 minutes. So if you change the slide, I'll continue. So the first point that I want to raise, without making this too much a matter of semantics, is to do with this idea of a transition. So in the fields in which we work and the fields in which I do my work, I hear a lot about the transition to sustainability, for example, or how to achieve the transition in the energy sector or the energy system. Bearing in mind the depth of change and the extent of change that we need to get to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, to me that sounds more fundamental and maybe of a different quality from going from point A to point B. And transition tends to have that kind of feel about it as language. I wonder if we should really be thinking of what transformations to society are going to be required in terms of enabling us to do what we do in such a way that brings people into the picture and feeling that they've got some agency or positive role to play in achieving these transformations, but also in terms of how we obtain the knowledge that might be relevant to doing so and deploy it. So this notion of transition is something that we might want to question. Now, in the picture there, you've got the front page from an edited book that I and some other co-editors had published just a couple of years ago by Routledge. And it's about actions that we might take to enable a more sustainable future. In this particular case, it was to do with consumption, but with the core of it being to do with societal transformation. It's about social change. And to me, it's hard to imagine that we're going to achieve net zero without some quite fundamental changes in society. Can you change the slide, please? And similarly, it prompts me to think about what innovation means in this context. I mean, my work has been on innovation in the energy sector mostly since the late 1980s. And typically, like many other innovation researchers who've got an interest in sustainability and energy, I've, especially in the first maybe half of my career, focused on technology, the things you can touch often, the physical technology. Okay, we talk about software now as well. But it's been very much about machines, and new types of machine are important. So we talk about renewable energy and microgeneration and all kinds of different kinds of plant and facilities. But what we tend to talk less about is where the people sort of fit in amongst all these machines, or in making decisions about them, or in using them. So I would like to speak about production, yes, and generation of energy, and what kinds of systems we have, and what kinds of technologies we have in the hardware sense. But we do need to reckon on consumption, and of course people talk more about prosumption now. So this is those who consume, who can generate their own energy, for example. So I'm glad to hear consumption and demand referred to by both Jim and Sarah, because I think this is something that very easily slips under the the radar. So there needs to be more attention to consumption and also to prosumption, as well as the production and generation of energy. Although, of course, we're not, we don't want to boil this down to an energy only discussion, but we're here talking about a very important part of the puzzle in terms of energy. What I want to refer to in my further comments are some reflections on a project that finished 6 months ago called Energize. And Energize was funded by the European Commission to look at kind of rebalancing this kind of tendency to focus on production and have develop more of an understanding of consumption. Could we change slide, please? So, Energize is a Horizon 2020 project. It was a 3-year project, and in the picture you can see myself and some of my colleagues, and also some members of the policy advisory panel that we set up. So the key questions that we considered within the project were about how to engage citizens in the European Union in this energy transition. That was the language that the call used. And actually there was some disagreement and debate amongst the project team about using transition or transformation. What approaches can we use, or should we use, to engage citizens better, more effectively? And connected with that, what about living labs? Living labs have become this slightly voguish idea, but very sort of ill-defined. So one question that we sought to address on Energize was, what role might there be for energy living labs in understanding consumption better, in experimenting with ways in which to change energy use practices and reduce the amount of energy people use at home? And so we set this within the context of EU decision-making and policy-making, and also in terms of the individual countries represented, members of the EU, but also other European countries. Could you change a slide, please? So one of the first things we did on Energize was to develop a typology of sustainable energy consumption initiatives in 30 countries. Now, essentially, I don't have much time to go into this, but we had a total of over 1,000 such initiatives from these 30 countries. The vast majority could be characterized as being concerned with some kind of technical development or change, installing a new technology to improve energy efficiency, or generating energy from renewable sources, or as changes in individual behavior. So to do with purchasing, for example, nudging people to make better or more informed choices in terms of what they buy or consume. Far less attention is devoted to the other two categories, such as changes in everyday life situations, which is to do with how people consume or demand energy within a particular domain, showering, for example, or changes in complex interactions between different domains. So, for example, linked to or linking the need to have clean clothes with being presentable at work. And all of that maybe being some factor of how far people have to travel wearing the same clothes on a hot day, for example. So then you get a connection there between doing the laundry at home, work, the work environment, and transportation. So there's a lot less attention to looking at change in energy consumption in that more complex way. Can you change the slide, please? What we did in the Energized Living Labs was to try and get at this more complex array or configuration of domains by devising and implementing Energized Living Labs. So these living labs were operated in 8 countries, and there were 2 kinds of living labs which we ran between August 2018 and March 2019. So one type was based on individual households who worked with the implementation teams in each country to either accept a given challenge to reduce the heating temperature in their homes and to reduce laundry cycles, the amount of laundry that they did in each week. Or it was a living lab could be a collective phenomenon. So a kind of community or focus group approach where we brought together households more collectively to sort of exchange their thoughts about achieving given challenges or ones they devised themselves, and to share notes, if you like, on how they were getting on and the challenges they faced in doing so. So the early part of this timeline, August, well, it actually begins before that, July and August 2018 is where we recruited households across the 8 countries. And then through August and September, we have some initial home visits and some benchmarking work, developing a baseline of initial usage in terms of laundry, the amount that people did at the beginning, and also in terms of heating, what temperatures people regulated their homes at the beginning. And then we had a sort of challenge period in the middle, so going through sort of October to December. We asked participants to note down on a card their pledge in terms of what temperature they would seek to regulate their home heating to, and also in terms of what amount of laundry they think they thought they could reduce, as well. In terms of the post-challenge period, when you get into December, there's a further series of home visits and the community meeting for the collective living lab groups, a closing survey, and then in February, March, you get a final survey which aimed to encourage participants to think about the challenges that they had taken up and whether they met those challenges and whether they were continuing to sort of live by the challenges. So this is to try and get at the durability of the changes in practices. Next slide, please. The findings overall, this is the headline table. So there are many tables I could show you on the findings, but if I wanted to boil it all down, then essentially households across the 8 countries in these living labs were able to reduce the temperature settings at home by at least 1 degree in their living rooms on average, and 1.4 degrees in their bedrooms. And they were able to reduce the weekly wash cycle by 1 or nearly 2, depending on the size of the family. Next slide, please. Now we get to the implications of the project and some thinking, some reflections that might be helpful to our discussions about net zero. So first implication and this is me, actually the picture is me talking at our closing conference about this. The first implication is about funding initiatives which are founded upon investigations of the performance of daily practices. So this is to say that how people do things at home every day matters. Okay, and that's not typically what people tend to focus on. Secondly, to think about and invoke the concept of sufficiency. So we hear a lot about energy efficiency, but maybe we could also think about encouraging participants, such as those on our project, to think about using only what they need to use. Okay, this is going to vary according to the type of participant, obviously, but for those who may be using, quotes, far more than they really need, it's to maybe just prompt them to think about, well, actually, how much do I need to leave the central heating on? So there's a different kind of mindset. The third point is to do with the nature of upscaling. So we heard quite a lot about scalability, and I wonder if we might think about different notions of scalability and notions of scale. So we can think about the rollout of a centralized program and scaling that, like the smart energy program, or we might think about replication, but with sensitivity to local conditions and local differences. So this is not the rollout of a universal program. It's maybe a bit more sensitive to what's required in particular localities. So there may be one may be able to devise a sort of a relatively generic template, but it needs to be flexible enough to be adaptable to particular locales. And then the final point on this slide is to do with the complementarity of technology-focused or energy-efficient measures with practice-focused initiatives. So think about how the two can work in a complementary way. Can we have the next slide, please? So IT, for example, and this came up quite a lot on the project, we've concluded that it may be, or smart provisions, smart technologies, may be a complementary element within a package of measures, a suite of measures, which might be designed to help households, citizens, communities, users, as they attempt to challenge themselves regarding the energy use practices that they have. So again, it's a point about complementarity. The second point might be to do with how we engage different socioeconomic groups rather than the usual suspects. Now, I'm thinking here about the Committee for Climate Change and their comments that we need to better engage the public, but we need to understand what that means. Since the public aren't a monolithic block, we need to understand differences amongst these publics and what different kinds of treatments or processes might be more amenable to eliciting their active support. And also to elicit the support of various other actors in running initiatives such as the Energize Living Labs. So these may be energy utilities, businesses, NGOs, as well as the local population. And there may be a particular need for researchers to adjust or rethink their own approach or role within this. And we may be looking at different kinds of constellations of STEM and social sciences researchers and humanities. And I think we're seeing some of that, but we may need to see more. Can we change slide, please? So in conclusion, I think in achieving and enduring net zero, so it's not a point about reaching net zero in 2049 and then job done. If we want something which is more durable, we need to think of, I think we need to think about how policymaking best utilizes social sciences and humanities research in tandem with STEM-based disciplines. And I think Jim used the word multidisciplinarity. A lot of people use the word interdisciplinarity. And again, without getting too caught up on the language, I think there are differences that we need to think about in terms of these ways of working together. I've been to various sand pits where the facilitators try to get people from STEM researchers and social scientists to work together on a common project with a common mindset that's more interdisciplinary, and found that very, very difficult and very challenging. It may be that we need to think about how we can work together, but without feeling that we need to develop one all-seeing, holistic perspective that can possibly represent all researchers coming from all different disciplines. The next point that I want to make is about being more comfortable, researchers being more comfortable with this multi-actor approach. Many of us, I mean, certainly I did my PhD in the late 1980s. This wasn't a typical way of thinking about what counts as research, working with a vast array of different stakeholders. You know, the idea was that you got your questions from the literature, you pursued those questions, you got the data, and you did good work and analysed it and published it. But now it feels like the work that I'm doing and needing to do is more in concert with people who aren't researchers. And that actually is probably quite a good thing in some ways, but difficult in others for an academic in terms of still being able to get the productivity you need for the REF and such like. And then one more point on this slide, and this is to say that maybe we need a different or a new energy imaginary. I'll go to the next slide. The picture there is of a Hastings seafront, where we did our field work. Okay, I can't go through all of this, I don't have time, but fundamentally, I wonder if we need to move from a more technically focused imaginary of what energy transformation requires to one which is based more on practices and cultural change. I'll just take two rows. One is on policy focus. So currently there's a lot of talk about energy efficiency and the uptake of renewables. I don't disagree with that, but it may be that we need something which is more sensitive to local energy practices and getting people involved on the ground. Okay, the final point I'll make is about civic epistemologies, so to do with knowledge and what knowledge we get and how we get it. In the technical and behavioural change imaginary, it seems to be more about providing information so that consumers make better choices. This kind of fits with nudge. But on the practices and cultural change imaginaries, it's more about understanding energy cultures and how to change practices by working with people. So it's more co-productive research, more co-creative. And that I think is a different kind of sensibility that we might need to move to. Okay, thank you very much. That's the end of my presentation. Open to questions and a good discussion. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that, Wadley. Sarah, could I ask you to put your video camera back on, and perhaps we can see everyone's smiling faces. Thank you to all three presenters. It's very, very interesting to me how we've covered the research landscape with Sarah, the funding landscape with Jim, and then the policy landscape somewhat with Audley, and actually how people fit into all that as well. And I've coined a new phrase, if you don't mind, Audley, of under the radiator, how we've got energy policy, how do we get it? I like that better than under the radar, actually.
Oh, no. Don't repeat that one outside this webinar, please.
Okay, thank you very much for all that. I've opened up the chat window, if you like, for everyone to post some questions. People who have posted questions, can I ask you to just give us your name that you would like to be known as in the discussion, and also the organisation that you're with. It just helps us put some context into the questions. Because I'm going to chair this panel, I think we've got about 30 minutes left. Because I'm going to chair it, I'm going to ask the first questions, if that's okay. I've got one for Jim and one for Audley, if that's okay. So firstly, for Jim, I wondered, you mentioned how much energy research money is going into energy research, and I just wondered what proportion of the engineering portfolio that is given over to energy, or does it cross a few different portfolio groups?
It crosses a number of them. So I'm getting an echo off somebody else there. Yeah, so there's several areas of the engineering portfolio crosses around the built environment, around combustion, around a lot around aviation and transport. Then we'll also see quite a lot of overlap with particularly the physical sciences, particularly around sort of new materials for energy, and they specifically have a research area that they're trying to promote around materials for energy. And then I think sort of also sort of in the ICT and digitization and AI area, we'll probably see considerably more coming as well.
Okay, thank you very much for that. And then my question for Audley is, what kind of innovation and experimentation did Energize project find worked best for vulnerable and low-income citizens, or was it not really targeted on socio-economic groups?
Okay, sorry, just noting down the question. Well, it wasn't specifically targeted on vulnerable groups, the project, but it so happens that one of the living labs that we had in the UK was based on people who went to a mosque in Hastings, and many of them would fit into that category. Now, very interesting for me is that the fact that ours was pretty much the only living lab that had that kind of audience, if you like, or participant. So this is in 8 European countries. And then secondly, how that living lab seemed to vary from the other UK living lab and all the other living labs. So what we found is that I'm not sure what kind of innovation I would associate with the more vulnerable group, but the kind of engagement did seem to be very different. The quality of it needed to be different. We needed to run different subgroups of the collective living lab to cater for the division between male and female, for example, which no other group had to deal with, no other living lab had to contend with. We had to think about what kind of challenges could be, might be successful for this group where more people lived with several generations living in one dwelling, for example, or more people coming from a background where the quote normal temperature of one's homes was a lot higher than for other groups. So for across the project, across not just the UK, but across the different countries, it was often a question of, well, the baseline says you're heating your home at sort of 20. Can you get it to 19 or 18? For some people, it was, well, 18, you know, I'm already doing 18. Can I go to 17? Or, you know, okay, fine, you're ahead of the curve, maybe. But then for this particular group, it's, well, okay, you're at 25. Okay, can you get to 23 or 22? And that being perceived as quite difficult because partly cultural. So I don't know about innovations, but certainly the way we needed to work with people in this particular quote vulnerable group was quite different from how we had to work with the other living lab in the UK, and I think very different from our partners in you know, across the water. Hello.
Thank you very much. Sorry, I'm still muted. It's definitely something we must consider across Europe, not just only in the UK. So I'll open the questions out to the ones that have been posted in the chat window here. So we've got a couple of great ones from Pavan from Newcastle University in Singapore. I'm not sure how late in the evening this is, but thank you for joining us, Pavan. Two questions are, what are the sources of bioenergy in UK and Europe? And what is the current state of the art interest in CO2 mineralization, if anyone has got any expertise in those areas?
I can add about bioenergy. So our Supergen Energy Networks Hub is part of a wider group of Supergens, and there's a Supergen Bioenergy Hub. So I'd recommend Pavan looking on there. But in terms of sources of bioenergy currently in the UK, then we're looking at agricultural and forestry waste. Primarily, there's a small amount of dedicated crop growing for biomass, but the majority is actually waste from agriculture and forestry. But some of the work being done by the Supergen Bioenergy Hub is to understand better what the potential is for specifically grown crops, the area available, the energy content of those, the ways in which they could be converted into gas or liquid fuels, and how then they might be used in different sectors. So they've got quite a lot of information on the Bioenergy Hub webpage in relation to that, and they do have some information about Europe as well on there.
Thank you, Sarah. I think I'm unmuted. The next question, does anyone have any thoughts on CO2 mineralisation?
No, I was going to, apart from making exactly the same point Sarah was just made about bioenergy, but probably far less detail, is we have the UK CCS Research Centre, UK CCSRC at Sheffield, who would be the people I would go to ask about that.
Okay, thank you. Next question we have is from Dan Newbury from Ferric Media and Ferric Records. Oops, sorry, there's two questions. What are the current, first of all, he's thanked the speakers, and he's then asked, are there currently estimates for how much economic investment will be needed into net zero R&D to meet the Paris Agreement? So do you know how much the research is going to cost with regards to the question? And he's got another question, but we'll leave it there for this one. Anyone's got any thoughts on that?
So my understanding is the Committee for Climate Change report does talk about the overall cost, not for R&D specifically, but the overall cost to meet Paris Agreement targets. I can't remember the number off the top of my head, so apologies for that. We had a recent sort of industry roundtable, and effectively they said it's sort of based on that number. The amount of money that the UK is putting into R&D needs increasing sort of between 2 and 3 fold to make a significant input.
Okay, thank you. And Dan's next question is, for small businesses, have you found that definite policy works more effectively for lowering emissions, or general advice and guidance without any legal binding? So I guess the question is round about how do you incentivize small businesses, which policy mechanism works?
Can I take that one? Well, I mean, so you can approach this partly as a matter of self-interest, dare I say. If one approached it in terms of energy efficiency or sufficiency, the small business would probably find that it's within their own interest to reduce energy use. So policies tailored towards initiatives which can help them to recognize what their quotes real needs are, and to reduce their consumption levels to those should be helpful. I mean, I was involved in some workshops that I did with the Carbon Trust, which was basically about enabling small businesses to identify what their energy usage was, kind of where it was coming from, those kind of hidden things that you don't think about, but also to develop means for, after diagnosis, reducing those areas in which it wasn't as necessary to use as much electricity or heat as was being used. So I think small businesses, maybe not unlike much of the rest of the economy, may find that they can make some savings in changing practices in a relatively incremental way, with a little bit of help and support. Now, I'm not going to, I wouldn't want to reduce this to I wouldn't want to reduce this to, well, we only have to treat people as consumers and help them to save money on their bill, because there's a lot of attention to that. But that is one place you can start. You don't have to pay out as much if you use less energy, and you don't probably need to use as much energy as you are. And this is also a COVID question, I suppose. You look at how small businesses are struggling, have been struggling over the last 3 months or so. Maybe now COVID provides what we call a rupture. It's a rupture in the normal way of things, which can allow the small business owner or manager and also government to think, okay, maybe we can, this is an opportunity here. Whilst people have got their attention sort of focused on how to stay alive as a business, we might be able to develop some programs which can help them reduce the energy they use.
Yeah, and I can maybe add something to this as well. In the northeast of England, initially in County Durham, but now it's been rolled out across the other areas of the northeast. They've actually trialled working directly with, so getting experts in energy efficiency to work directly with SMEs, and that's funded through the ERDF programme, and it's funded support, so it can be little to no cost to the SME themselves, and just using some technical experts to help them map through their business and see where the efficiency gains can be made. That's been extremely successful and is actually used as a case study for across Europe now. So the original project was, as I said, Durham County Council, and it was named BEEP, and the rollout across the rest of the northeast is called BEST. So I've put the link to both of those on the chat window. Is there any other questions? We have one from Janis, who I know who's from Newcastle University, and I'll just read it out to for the panel. So we will have increasingly more instances where there is too much wind solar on the network, as during last bank holiday weekend. Hence the emphasis should shift from energy conservation towards time of use measures, incentivising users to use energy when there is a surplus of it. This has serious consequences for devices and control. Is there any comments that to Janis's statement there? Agree or disagree?
I'll maybe start. And certainly on average, we could say that it is easier for the UK to continue to decarbonise the power sector and move towards more renewables if the total amount of energy needed from our electricity system was less. So I think that energy conservation is important. I think in terms of time of use and shifting patterns, that consumers can play a role in that, but that domestic consumers perhaps aren't the only type to think of there. We should be also thinking about industrial and business users, and helping move some loads to time when there's lots of generation. And ultimately, we need to make sure that we've got as much flexibility as possible on the demand and use side in order to help with a lack of flexibility from some of our renewables at times of high renewable generation. Those two, wind and solar, are obviously quite strongly linked to weather patterns. So it's always good to think about networks that have a range of supply options or generation options, so that we do still have some flexibility in the generation as well. But certainly in terms of work being done across Europe, there's instances with networks that have very high penetration of renewables, and they're also having similar issues of balancing, and storage potentially is an area for us to help with that supply-demand balance.
It's an interesting point, Janis. I sometimes hear we've got too much wind and solar, but The flip of that is never once has wind and solar reached 100% of power supply. So it's just the mix, perhaps, is the mix is meaning that we must accept, for example, nuclear. We can't switch nuclear off. So the headroom that wind and solar have is perhaps not enough, and hence we've got to have this flexibility for the control of the system.
Can I just pitch in here, Laura?
Please.
So regardless of the network supply characteristics, I think there is scope for improving or innovations in design of devices and how they're controlled. And what we found on Energize is that the present devices that people have in their home, the appliances that people have in their home, people struggle with. They don't really understand how to control and set the temperature in their homes, and they needed quite a lot of support and advice to help them do that. Maybe manufacturers could maybe take this as something that's worked for them in terms of the design of the device, in terms of the manual that no one ever actually reads. And it's a similar thing in terms of laundry. Washing machines, my goodness me, people really have a lot of problem with that. So whatever the network issues are, just in the home, people don't know how to use the appliances properly, and it's not their fault, so it's not a deficit thinking sort of thing. It may be that the actual design of the device and the instruction book could be improved. And also, just thinking back to Laura's question about innovation, it's a different kind of innovation, but some of our implementation team partners on Energize developed new services for the participants or subgroup of the participants. So in Hastings, we worked with a group called Energize Sussex Coast, and on the back of the project, they developed a new sort of process or offering to refugees or people coming from a refugee background or a Muslim background, specifically tailoring advice services for them on energy use in the home. So it's not innovation in the conventional sense, but it was something that happened.
James, yeah? Jim,
Yeah,
sorry.
I just completely agree with everything everyone said. I mean, I think the other point is I can only see greater electrification of the power system happening as we go forward. So the need for increased energy efficiency and flexibility are going to be even more important, not less important. But equally, it seems inevitable there'll be greater decentralization from the very centralized sort of approach that we currently have. And maybe there's sort of opportunities there as well for providing some of the sort of flexibility that Sarah was talking about.
Thank you. One question I have for the panel is round about, and Audley mentioned regional sensitivities. I'm from Scotland originally, and even geographically very close to the northeast where I'm based now, the northeast of England. The energy systems and the policies around energy are very different. My question to the panel is, how can we take that into account and as we make this transition? I personally think that there's low-hanging fruit of different types in different regions of the country. What's people's thoughts on that?
I'll start if you like. So in terms of potential transformation, I like that word from Audley rather than transition. In terms of transformation, then one thing that we're looking at in some research at the Supergen Energy Networks Hub is whether there is benefit to more regionally based approaches. So particularly when you're looking at renewable energy opportunities, then they could be geographically dispersed in different ways across the UK. So we might see more opportunity to develop wind energy in Scotland and biomass in Wales, for example. We might have more opportunity for offshore wind along our coasts, obviously. There might be limited opportunity for hydro, but hydro, again, Scotland and Wales, in terms of potential areas of land with high reservoirs for pumped hydro. And so geographically, the generation technologies might be more appropriate in certain places. But geographically, there's also potential opportunities due to the population density, the nature of the population, the nature of the industry, which varies across the UK as well. And so in some respects, it's nice to think that we're all ever so slightly different from our neighbours, and we do deserve something that's very special for us. But there's some logical reasons to that as well as an energy system. And that seems to be more so the case once you look at certain of our islands that are still part of the UK, that have very specific geographies, very specific industries, mainly tourism. And so there's a slightly more nuanced approach that they need as well in terms of their policy for development to ensure that they're achieving this transformation in a way that's sustainable and cost effective.
Thank you, Sarah.
Can I
Please
sorry,
do.
can I echo partly what Sarah was saying? I would like to see more decentralized, or at least regionally networked funding. So where what's being funded is a combination of research and impactful actions. So it's not to weaken research, it's to make the more purposeful application of research to energy problems sort of come to the fore. And who are being supported is a mixture of researchers, local authorities, utilities, NGOs, all sort of coalescing around some kind of idea of a devolved plan in a more kind of regional or local sort of setting. So the products of that are, yes, you're still driven by research questions. I wouldn't want to lose that, but they need to be negotiated with these different groups, and in a very different way from writing the impact plan as it was at the end of your application for funding. It's something which is much more organic and much more kind of problem-centered, and involves lots of input from STEM researchers, social scientists, and other groups in society, more genuinely co-productive.
I don't have anything really to add to what the other two have already said. I mean, I think one thing we are expecting to see is a lot of pilots going on, say, particularly in some of the big metropolitan cities around things like sort of decarbonising transport and decarbonising heat. And I think these provide a real opportunity for researchers. I think what we haven't really got is how is that actually going to happen? And I think that's sort of a challenge going forward. But I think it is pretty much exactly as orderly as Sarah described.
One more question from me, if there's nothing more from the audience. Oh, we're running short of time, sorry. I've got you all here and you will answer my questions. It's just round about how can we, or it's really difficult, Jim, and I don't envy you this, but there's a vast array of different research programs going on. How do we make sure that everyone knows about everything that's going on so that they can tie in to where they feel they can add most value, particularly in that intersection with industry? If I could give an example of hydrogen at the moment, it's got a lot of emphasis on it, but who does hydrogen in the UK? You know what I mean? What's the best way for the research councils to signpost industry to who can give them the best help, perhaps?
It's a difficult question. I think in terms of telling the story about sort of what's happening in sort of certainly within academia and what's sort of UKRO funded and where people go to get the information. I think we certainly see sort of COP26 as an opportunity perhaps to bring things together more in the way you've described than perhaps we have done in the past, where I think we are slightly guilty of funding lots of really good stuff, but possibly not telling the story back to people about what that means altogether. So I think we certainly see that as the major opportunity. Sorry, I've forgotten the other part of your question. So.
No, it was just mainly around this. How do we, we're doing this great stuff, how does how do we make it really visible to whoever, so industry come to me, for example, and go, who's doing this and where's the best people to reach out to? And there's not a neat tangible database to go, just Google this here and you'll find the answer. I don't know. Anyway, it's we'll leave that for another day.
Well, we have been, so this is something that particularly BEIS are keen to try and develop. So the latest incarnation is the Net Zero Innovation Board, which looks at how trying to coordinating sort of activities sort of across government, across research, and how people sort of get involved in it. They've made a number of attempts in the past to develop the sort of those sorts of databases you've just described, so that people can get that sort of information sort of throughout. So if you like the sort of the TRL type levels. Within UKRI, I think sort of certainly sort of EPSC, we sort of have a relatively good sort of outward looking at databases that people can look at, so through Gateway Research and grants on the web. And I think really what they're trying to do is do the equivalent of that across the various different levels and different sort of audiences you get with the different government departments. I mean, I think the problem then is how do you describe things? So if you describe things sort of purely on a technology basis, it's relatively straightforward, but that isn't necessarily what people actually need. They're actually sort of much more interested in the outcome that they're after. And I think it also does develop a very technology-centric sort of view of the world, which is insufficient for actually sort of solving the problems that we have in net zero.
Okay, that's a fair point, actually. So thanks for reminding us about the grants on the web options, by the way.
Thank you.
Is there any other questions from the audience before I close? Because we're running a little bit to time now. So there's nothing, no one's putting anything in the chat window. I'd like to again thank my colleague Kate Kelly for running this session for us, and I'd also like to thank our guest speakers, Sarah Walker, James Fleming and Audley Genus, and I thank again the audience for staying with us and asking such interesting questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Bye everyone.